Before we begin recounting the events of the following war, if you're someone who enjoys history and the stories of soldiers and battles that changed the world, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the events we cover here. And share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever served in the military, or do you wish you could experience what it's like to serve? Your opinions mean a lot to us and help us build a true community of history enthusiasts. Throughout history, the world has come frighteningly close to nuclear Armageddon. Moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis, false alarms from early warning systems, and even accidental bomb drops brought humanity to the brink. Each time, the Cold War between NATO and the Warsaw Pact threatened to ignite into a full-scale nuclear conflict. But one of the closest calls, and perhaps one of the least known, came in November 1983 during a NATO exercise known as Able Archer 83. A military simulation so realistic, it convinced the Soviet Union that the West was preparing for a real nuclear strike. This was the world's near miss with total destruction. A moment when the smallest misunderstanding could have ended civilization. In this chapter, we'll explore how it happened, why the Soviets believed a NATO attack was imminent, how close we came to nuclear war, and what might have happened if the Cold War had suddenly gone hot. The Cold War begins. The Cold War took shape in the aftermath of World War II. On one side stood the United States and its NATO allies. On the other, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. This was not a shooting war. It was a war of ideology. Capitalism versus communism, freedom versus control. A deep, mutual mistrust led both sides to amass unprecedented stockpiles of nuclear weapons. Enough firepower to destroy the planet several times over. The world teetered on a knife's edge. From the Berlin blockade and the Korean War to the Cuban Missile Crisis, each confrontation brought humanity within moments of annihilation. But the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the idea that any nuclear strike would guarantee both sides' extinction, kept the peace, if only barely. By the 1970s, tensions began to ease. Both sides signed a series of arms control agreements. This period of relative calm became known as détente. But détente was fragile, and it was about to collapse. The end of détente. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, ending any illusion of long-term peace. The United States, under President Jimmy Carter, withdrew from the SALT II arms control talks in protest. When Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981, the tone changed dramatically. Reagan took a hardline stance against the Soviet Union, calling it an evil empire. He began a sweeping modernization of both nuclear and conventional U.S. forces, and expanded America's efforts to contain communism across South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Many of the U.S. fears about communist expansion were exaggerated, but the rhetoric and military buildup escalated tension to levels not seen since the early 1960s. Inside the Kremlin, anxiety turned into paranoia. In May 1981, KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov told senior Soviet officials that he believed the United States was preparing for a surprise nuclear strike on the USSR. The Soviets decided they needed a way to detect, and if possible preempt, such an attack. Operation Ryan, the Soviets prepare. That same year, the Soviets launched the largest peacetime intelligence-gathering operation in their history. It was called Operation Ryan, short for Raketno-Ядерное нападение, meaning nuclear missile attack. Its purpose was simple, yet chilling: to find evidence of NATO preparing for a first strike. To do that, Soviet agents were ordered to monitor every conceivable signal. Unusual troop movements, spikes in military radio traffic. the evacuation of Western diplomats, even sudden increases in blood donations or electricity usage near NATO command centers. In London, one of the men tasked with carrying out Operation Ryan was Oleg Gordievsky, a high-ranking KGB officer who was secretly working as a double agent for Britain's MI6. According to Gordievsky, the concept of Operation Ryan came directly from the Soviet military. It was then approved by the Politburo, whose conservative members were convinced the West might strike at any moment. They issued the order to the GRU military intelligence and the KGB. Watch for signs of nuclear war. Report immediately. The world on edge. For the first 2 years, Operation Ryan turned up little of concern. But then came 1983, the year everything changed. On March 23, 1983, President Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars. It was an ambitious plan to build a space-based missile shield that could intercept incoming nuclear warheads. To the Soviets, it shattered the fragile balance of deterrence. If the US could block Soviet missiles, then mutually assured destruction no longer applied. Then in September, disaster struck. The Soviets shot down Korean Airlines Flight 7, a civilian airliner they mistakenly believed to be a US spy plane. All 269 people on board were killed, including an American congressman. Just weeks later, the Soviet early warning system detected what appeared to be a US nuclear launch. Missiles seemed to be inbound, but the duty officer, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, made a fateful decision. He dismissed the alarm as a computer error. He was right. The false alert had been caused by sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds. His calm judgment may have saved the world. By the fall of 1983, tensions were reaching a breaking point. In November, the West German Bundestag approved the deployment of American Pershing II missiles on German soil. These mobile, medium-range ballistic missiles carried 80-kiloton nuclear warheads and could reach Soviet targets in as little as 10 minutes. For the Soviet leadership, it was an existential threat. With so little warning time, their only possible defense would be to strike first. The stage was set for a catastrophic misunderstanding, and NATO was about to begin an exercise that would push both sides to the edge of Armageddon. By 1983, Cold War tensions had reached a dangerous new peak. The fragile calm of détente was gone, and both East and West were once again preparing for the unthinkable. The world had entered a period of deep suspicion, mutual fear, and massive military buildup. A time when one false reading on a radar screen could have set off a chain reaction that ended civilization itself. In March of that year, President Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a visionary yet controversial program soon dubbed Star Wars. Its goal: to create a system that could intercept incoming nuclear missiles before they reached American soil. To the Soviets, this was not a defensive shield. It was a direct threat. If the United States could shoot down Soviet missiles, it would destroy the delicate balance of power known as mutually assured destruction. Suddenly, the idea that neither side could survive a nuclear war no longer seemed guaranteed. Then, on September 1, 1983, an event shocked the world. A Korean Airlines passenger jet, Flight 7, strayed into Soviet airspace, believing it to be a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft. Soviet interceptors fired without hesitation. The plane was shot down, killing all 269 people on board, including an American congressman. The world's outrage was immediate. In Washington, Moscow's actions were seen as reckless, even barbaric. In the Kremlin, the incident only deepened the fear that the West was preparing for a preemptive strike. Later that same month, another terrifying episode unfolded, this one hidden from public view for years. On September 26th, Soviet early warning systems detected what appeared to be 5 incoming American nuclear missiles. Alarms blared, lights flashed, computers screamed of impending apocalypse. But the officer on duty, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, hesitated. His instincts told him something was wrong. He chose not to report the alert as an actual launch, and he was right. The attack was a false alarm caused by a rare alignment of sunlight on satellite sensors. His calm decision in those fateful minutes may have saved the world from total destruction. By November, the Cold War was teetering on a knife's edge. In West Germany, the Bundestag voted to allow the deployment of American Pershing II missiles, a move that terrified Soviet military planners. These new weapons were mobile, fast, and deadly accurate. Unlike intercontinental missiles, which took half an hour to reach their targets, the Pershing II could strike Moscow in just 10 minutes. To the Soviet High Command, this was the nightmare scenario: a sudden, unstoppable nuclear decapitation strike that would leave them no time to respond. It was in this climate of fear and paranoia that NATO prepared to carry out its annual military exercise, Able Archer 83. On paper, it was just a routine training drill. In reality, it would become one of the most dangerous misunderstandings in modern history. For years, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact had conducted massive military simulations. These war games were designed to test readiness, improve coordination, and demonstrate strength. In 1983, NATO's umbrella exercise was called Autumn Forge, a large-scale conventional conflict that would eventually escalate into the nuclear phase known as Able Archer. No troops would fire a single shot. Instead, high-ranking officers would rehearse the complex procedures for authorizing and executing a nuclear strike. But Able Archer 83 was different. For the first time, NATO planners introduced a series of changes that made the exercise eerily realistic. Coded communications were rewritten, new encryption methods were used, and long periods of radio silence were imposed. Even more alarming to Soviet intelligence, real heads of state, including President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher, were involved in parts of the simulation. To outside observers, these moves didn't look like a drill. They looked like the final steps before an actual attack. The scenario began with Soviet forces invading Yugoslavia, then pushing through Scandinavia and into Western Europe. Overwhelmed by superior numbers, NATO troops were forced to retreat. After months of heavy fighting, the situation in the simulation grew desperate. At that point, NATO commanders authorized the use of tactical nuclear weapons, first on the battlefield, then against Soviet command centers. From NATO's perspective, it was all theoretical, a rehearsal of what might happen. But inside the Soviet Union, alarm bells rang. Around November 8th or 9th, KGB officer and British double agent Oleg Gordievsky received an urgent message from Moscow Center. The telegram warned that the United States and its allies might be using this exercise as a cover for a real nuclear strike. The instructions were clear: watch for any unusual signs, evacuations at the American embassy, movements near NATO command centers, or increased communication traffic. Anything could be the signal that the West was about to launch. The scenario NATO had designed, a massive Soviet invasion followed by a nuclear counterattack, matched perfectly with what Soviet intelligence was already most afraid of. The parallels were chilling. To them, this wasn't just coincidence, it was confirmation. As Able Archer unfolded, Soviet military units in Eastern Europe went on heightened alert. Strategic bombers were readied for takeoff. Nuclear warheads were loaded. Mobile missile units were moved into forward positions, prepared to strike at a moment's notice. And in Moscow, the aging and paranoid Soviet leader Yuri Andropov feared that his country was about to be destroyed. The irony was that NATO officers had no idea how tense the situation had become. To them, Able Archer was just another exercise, a technical rehearsal. But to the Soviets, It looked like the beginning of the end. Within hours, the fate of the planet hung in the balance. By mid-November 1983, the stage was set for catastrophe. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, fear and miscommunication had brought the world closer to nuclear war than at any other time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Inside the Soviet Union, military units were on edge, radar operators were tense, and nuclear bombers sat fully armed on airfields, engines running and ready to strike. To those in command, it no longer looked like a drill. It looked like the beginning of World War III. Reports from Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB officer secretly working for Britain, paint a chilling picture of those final days of Able Archer 83. Soviet intelligence believed that the Americans were using the exercise as cover to launch a real nuclear attack. The coded communications, the unusual participation of political leaders, the sudden silence in NATO radio traffic, all were seen as unmistakable signs of an imminent first strike. From Moscow, urgent cables were sent to KGB stations around the world, ordering agents to watch for the smallest indicators of war, unusual embassy evacuations, strange troop movements, or signs of Western leaders being moved to bunkers. Every action, no matter how small, was viewed through the lens of paranoia. In response, the Soviets raised their nuclear readiness. Bomber crews were ordered to prepare for launch. Strategic missiles were repositioned closer to their firing sites. Divisions across Eastern Europe were mobilized. Some aircraft were even armed with live nuclear warheads, waiting for the signal to take off. It was, in every sense, a countdown to doomsday. And yet, at NATO command centers, the officers running Able Archer were completely unaware of how their exercise was being perceived. To them, this was just another routine simulation, a carefully planned, fully contained military drill. But to the men in the Kremlin, it looked like the United States and its allies were moments away from pressing the button. This was the moment when humanity stood on the very edge of nuclear Armageddon. But then nothing happened. At the height of the crisis, NATO's intelligence analysts began receiving faint indications that the Soviet Union had moved to a higher state of alert. Lieutenant General Leonard Peretz, serving as Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence at U.S. Air Forces Europe, faced a decision that could have changed history. If he had ordered a reciprocal alert, if NATO had matched the Soviet readiness, it might have triggered a deadly feedback loop, each side reacting to the other until missiles were launched in panic. Instead, Peretz chose to do nothing. He decided not to escalate, not to raise alert levels, and not to mirror Soviet moves. It was an instinctive decision, based not on intelligence data, but on gut judgment. In hindsight, that single moment of restraint may have saved the world. Some historians have since argued that the Soviets exaggerated the danger, that their fear of a NATO strike was more political theater than genuine threat. But others, including many in the intelligence community, insist that Able Archer represented a truly perilous moment in human history. The Soviet leadership was old, sick, and deeply suspicious, and their arsenal, vast, powerful, and always on alert, left no margin for error. Had one radar operator misread a signal, or one commander panicked, nuclear war might have begun not by design, but by accident. To understand what was at stake, we only need to imagine what a nuclear exchange would have looked like in 1983. NATO's tactical warheads, like the American Pershing II or Britain's Polaris submarine-launched missiles, could unleash firepower hundreds of times greater than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A single 200-kiloton warhead detonated over a major city like London would vaporize everything within a mile, ignite firestorms across several more, and send radioactive debris into the upper atmosphere. The death toll would reach nearly 400,000 in moments. Now imagine tens of thousands of such warheads, 60,000 in total, being launched across continents. Cities across the northern hemisphere would vanish in hours. The blast waves, heat, and radiation would be followed by something even worse: the long, dark shadow of a nuclear winter. Dust and radioactive ash would block sunlight for years. Temperatures would plummet. Crops would fail. Global famine would kill billions who survived the initial explosions. The modern world, its technology, its economies, its nations would cease to function. Humanity would be thrust back into a dark age, struggling to survive in a poisoned world. In the end, there would be no victors. Nuclear war, as the world would later realize, is a zero-sum game. Everyone loses. But in 1983, by pure human instinct and a handful of calm decisions, that nightmare was avoided. When President Reagan was briefed on the Able Archer incident the following year, he was stunned. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the Soviet fear of the West was not an act, it was real. The Kremlin truly believed America might strike first. Reagan came to understand that the greatest danger to peace was not aggression, but misunderstanding, not weapons, but mistrust. That revelation changed him. Over the next few years, he sought to reduce nuclear stockpiles and open direct dialogue with the Soviets. His meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev would lead to a thaw in the Cold War and the eventual signing of major arms reduction treaties. The story of Able Archer 83 stands as a sobering reminder. Humanity came within a heartbeat of annihilation, not because of hatred or malice, but because of fear. It shows that in a world armed with thousands of nuclear weapons, survival can depend on a single human decision: the courage to wait, to question, to hesitate. And perhaps that, more than anything, is what saved the world in November 1983.